So what's the problem? After we look at the questions, who is God and who am I? Once we start to dive into those, we must take the next step and answer the question, what is the problem? Now, the problem I'm talking about isn't the fact that you're sick today, or that your back hurts, or that the kids are acting up, or that you're being bullied at school, or people are talking bad about you behind your back, or you got a hangnail, or you failed your test that you didn't study for, or that you got stuck in traffic, or any of this. Those aren't the problems I'm talking about. I'm not even talking about bigger problems like violence and poverty and hunger and greed and corrupt governments and earthquakes or hurricanes or fires. I'm not even talking about those problems. I want to know if there is a problem. What is the problem? Is there something from which all of these other problems and situations flow out of? Because I think that sometimes we can get so caught up in focusing on these little personal problems, maybe your own first world problems, or even global problems, global issues like violence, like climate change, like poverty, like corruption, that we fail to answer the big question of what is the problem. What was that? Let me look it up. What I'm getting at is kind of like what the Catholic priest Dom Helder Camara. Dom Helder Camara. What I'm getting at is similar to the statement made by the Catholic priest Dom Helder Camara when he says, "When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. But when I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist." He's looking past the problems around and trying to get at the heart of the problem. Not just about poverty and the problem of hunger, the problem of malnutrition, but the problem behind poverty. Why are there poor people in the first place? I think these are much bigger questions than our 24/7 news networks can handle. These news networks do a good job of keeping us afraid, of keeping us so focused on the little problems that are in our everyday life that we fail to focus on what is the big problem behind it all. They tend to focus on the fact of violence rather than why are people inherently violent. They tend to focus on the corrupt politicians rather than asking the question, can we have government that isn't corrupt? Is there something within us as people that make these things inevitable? What I see, according to my worldview and according to my faith, is that when we try to do things on our own, we will fail. When humanity gets behind the reins of our own destiny, of our own governments and our own powers, of our own wealth, of our own economies, of our own wars, when we get behind the reins and think that we have all the power, that's where we go terribly, terribly wrong. It's all because of this thing called sin. Now let me give you a definition of sin. Sin is anything that misses the mark, that isn't a bullseye on the target, anything that isn't a 100% on your test score. Sin is anything that goes against the will of God. Scripture tells us that we have all sinned and we all fall short of the glory of God. The Bible tells us there is no one who is perfectly righteous, not even one. That sin is something that affects us all. It says, just as through one man sin entered the world and affected everybody, in reference to the story of Adam and Eve in the garden. They had one rule and they still broke that one rule. And so sin entered the world. Corruption and brokenness entered the world. And guess what? The rest of creation was affected as well. In Romans chapter 8, Paul makes the case that even creation itself was subjected to this brokenness and violence. Not because of anything creation itself did, but because of stuff that we did. This world is broken and fallen and sinful. And the hope, the Christian hope, is that one day all will be restored. But we live in the in-between. This isn't heaven yet, not by a long shot. This world is not perfect, not even close. Neither are you, and neither am I. It's kind of like when a parent tells their child not to do something, and the child does it anyway. And then they get hurt because they did it. And the parent says, if you had just listened to me, you wouldn't be in this mess. If you had just done what I told you to do, you wouldn't have gotten hurt. If you had followed instructions, then you wouldn't have gotten in trouble. If you had just gone the speed limit, you wouldn't have gotten that speeding ticket. If you had studied for your test like I told you to, you wouldn't have failed. This idea of cause and effect, our parents, as much as we hate to admit it, often know more than we do. And they're better at forecasting the future effects of the choices that we make. And yet, how often are we willing to listen to them? I'm not saying we can follow every rule God has laid out for us perfectly. I'm not saying that we can fix everything just by living out the word as it's revealed in Scripture. That's not what I'm saying, because we can't. But what we can do is lean on God for a solution, which we'll talk about next week.